Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. My grandfather loved to tell stories. When I was young, he often sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, spinning tales of his younger days. One story always stood out to me, a chilling tale of his trip to a battlefield from World War II. This is that story, as he told it to me. It was the summer of 1963, and my grandfather, Edward Ed Walker, was a young man of 25, full of adventure and curiosity. He and his four friends Henry, Jim, David, and Frank had been planning a trip for months. They were going to visit a remote area of Europe, a place that had seen some of the most brutal fighting during World War II. This wasn't just any battlefield. It was the site of a legendary convoy disappearance, a mystery that had never been solved. Ed had always been fascinated by history, and this particular story intrigued him more than most. The tale of a convoy of military trucks that vanished one foggy night with no trace ever found haunted the local folklore. Some said the convoy had been ambushed, others whispered of something more sinister, a supernatural force that had taken them away. The group had booked a trip for 3 days and 2 nights, eager to explore the old battlegrounds, abandoned bunkers, and the surrounding forest. They didn't believe in the ghost stories, of course. They were there for history, for adventure, and maybe a few good scares along the way. On the day of departure, the 5 men piled into an old station wagon, packed with food, tents, and a few bottles of whiskey for the nights ahead. The road stretched out before them, winding through rolling hills and dense forests, the landscape growing more isolated as they neared their destination. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Henry asked, peering out the window as they drove deeper into the countryside. Ed nodded, a map spread across his lap. "Yeah, this is it. The village we're staying in is just a few miles away. It's pretty remote, but that's part of the charm, right?" The air grew cooler as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the trees. The road narrowed, twisting through the forest as they climbed higher into the hills. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving, they reached the village. It was a small, forgotten place, with just a few houses scattered around a central square. The village seemed trapped in time, its cobblestone streets and crumbling buildings remnants of a war that had ended long ago. Their hotel, the Old Soldier's Rest, was a large, stone structure that had once served as a barracks during the war. Now, it was a quaint inn for curious travelers like themselves. When they arrived, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting the entire village in an eerie twilight. The hotel loomed before them, its windows dark, as if no one had been inside for years. Frank shivered. "This place gives me the creeps already." "Come on, it's just old," Jim laughed, slapping Frank on the back. "It'll be fun. Besides, what better place to get spooked than a haunted battlefield?" They checked in with the hotel's owner, an elderly man with a thick accent and a serious demeanor. He didn't say much as he handed them their keys, but before they could leave, he offered one cryptic warning. "Stay on the paths," the old man said quietly, "and if you hear trucks in the night, don't follow them." Ed and his friends exchanged nervous glances, but they brushed it off as local superstition. They were here for a good time, not ghost stories. Their rooms were simple but clean, with large windows that overlooked the mist-covered forest. The air inside was thick with history, and Ed couldn't help but feel a slight chill as he unpacked his bag. There was something about this place that felt off. That night, after a hearty dinner at the village's only pub, they returned to the hotel and gathered in the common room. The fireplace crackled as they poured themselves whiskey, talking about the adventures they had planned for the next day. "So, we're checking out the convoy site tomorrow, right?" David asked, leaning back in his chair. "I heard it's only a few miles from here." "Yeah," Ed replied, looking at the map. "We'll hike up the old supply route. It's supposed to lead straight to where the trucks were last seen." As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew more relaxed. But just as they were about to call it a night, they heard a faint rumble, like distant thunder, echoing through the forest. Everyone froze. "Is that a truck?" Henry asked, his voice low. Ed stood and walked to the window. The night outside was still, the moon casting an eerie glow on the trees. But then, in the distance, through the mist that had settled over the forest, he saw a faint light, like headlights cutting through the fog. "It can't be," Ed whispered. "It's probably just someone else driving through the village." But deep down, he knew better. No one else was out here. No one else was on these roads, and those lights, they weren't from any modern vehicle. A sense of unease settled over the group as they made their way back to their rooms. None of them said it, but they all felt the weight of the history that surrounded them, and the fear that maybe, just maybe, the stories they'd heard weren't just stories after all. That night, as Ed lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the woods. And then, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard it again, the distant rumble of a convoy, echoing through the night. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the sound to go away, but it didn't. It only grew louder. The following morning, the 5 friends gathered at the breakfast table, each looking a bit more tired than the night before. The events of the previous night had left them shaken, though none of them admitted it out loud. They were determined to stick to their plan, to hike through the forest and find the location where the convoy had vanished all those years ago. Ed couldn't shake the sound of those trucks rumbling through the night. It had been so real, so unmistakable. But when he mentioned it to the group, they just shrugged it off as a dream or the wind playing tricks on his mind. "Maybe it was just your imagination," David said, biting into a piece of toast. "I mean, there are no roads out here. What kind of truck would even be driving through the forest?" Ed wanted to argue but kept quiet. Instead, he focused on the day ahead. They packed their bags, filled with supplies, and set out on foot towards the old supply route, following a trail that wound through the thick trees and overgrown paths. The morning was unusually quiet. The birds that usually chirped from the treetops were nowhere to be heard. Even the breeze seemed to have stilled, leaving only the sound of their boots crunching through the underbrush. As they walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The trees towered above them, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Mist clung to the ground in patches, swirling around their legs as they pushed forward. Henry, the most skeptical of the group, was the first to break the silence. "So, how far is this convoy site supposed to be? I don't want to get lost out here." Ed checked the map again, tracing their route with his finger. "Not far, maybe another mile or so." Jim snorted. "I don't know. Man, this place feels off. Like we're not supposed to be here." Frank, always the joker, laughed. "Come on, Jim, don't tell me you're scared. We're here to have fun, remember." But as they continued, it became harder to ignore the strange feeling that hung over them. The deeper they went, the denser the mist became, until it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees, which had once seemed so majestic, now appeared gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, David stopped in his tracks, raising a hand to silence the group. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft rustling of leaves. They all paused, listening intently. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet of the forest. But then, faint and distant, came a sound none of them had expected, the unmistakable clanking of metal, like chains being dragged across the ground. Henry frowned. "Is that machinery?" Jim shook his head. "No way. There's nothing out here. We're miles from the nearest road." Ed felt a chill crawl up his spine. "It sounds like trucks." They stood frozen for a moment, the sound growing louder, closer. It was unmistakable now, the deep rumble of engines, the grinding of gears, as if a convoy of trucks was approaching through the mist. But there was no road, no vehicles, Nothing but the thick forest and the fog that surrounded them. Suddenly, through the mist, they saw faint headlights flickering in the distance, barely visible through the haze. The convoy was moving towards them, slow and deliberate, as if the trucks were winding their way along some invisible road that only they could see. Jim took a step back, his voice trembling. "What the hell, that?" Ed's heart pounded in his chest. "I don't know, but we need to move, now." Without another word, they turned and ran, their boots slipping on the damp ground as they fled back towards the village. The sound of the convoy followed them, growing louder, as if the trucks were right on their heels. As they burst out of the tree line, panting and gasping for air, the sound abruptly stopped. The forest behind them was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. They stood there for a moment, catching their breath, exchanging nervous glances. No one said anything, but the fear in their eyes was clear. Whatever they had heard, whatever they had seen was no trick of the imagination. That evening, they sat in the common room of the Old Soldiers' Rest, nursing their drinks in silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did little to chase away the chill that had settled over them. Henry was the first to speak. "We should leave." The others nodded in agreement, but Ed hesitated. "We can't just go. We came all this way to find the convoy. We have to see this through." Jim shook his head. "Ed, whatever that was out there, it's not something we can explain. It's not safe." But Ed was determined. "One more day. We explore the last spot tomorrow. Then we leave. I promise." Reluctantly, the others agreed, though none of them looked particularly eager to venture back into the woods. The old man's warning echoed in their minds. "If you hear trucks in the night, don't follow them." That night, as Ed lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what they had encountered in the forest. And then, just as the darkness closed in around him, he heard it again, the distant rumble of engines, the clanking of metal chains, and the faint glow of headlights moving through the fog outside his window. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the sound didn't stop. It only grew louder. The morning after the eerie encounter with the ghostly convoy, the mood among the group was somber. The weight of what they had experienced lingered in the air like a fog that refused to lift. Ed's resolve was clear. He wanted to explore the last location marked on his grandfather's map, convinced that they were on the verge of uncovering something incredible. But the others were hesitant, their nerves frayed from the encounter the day before. The sky was overcast as they set out, the sun hidden behind thick, gray clouds. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, the towering trees casting long, skeletal shadows across their path. Every step they took was accompanied by the soft squelch of the mossy ground beneath their boots, as if the forest itself was trying to pull them deeper into its mysterious depths. Henry glanced around uneasily, his eyes darting to the shifting mist that seemed to cling to the trees like a living thing. "It feels different today," he muttered, "like the forest is watching us." David shivered, though the air wasn't particularly cold. "You're not the only one feeling it. I can't shake the sense that we're not alone." As they ventured further into the woods, the silence around them became almost suffocating. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind, which had been a constant companion, had stilled. It was as though the forest had drawn its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ed was determined to press on, but he couldn't ignore the unsettling atmosphere. Every sound seemed amplified: the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs beneath their feet. Even their own breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet of the forest. The mist, which had been a faint presence that morning, now thickened around them, swirling like spectral fingers, caressing their skin with an icy touch. The deeper they walked, the more disorienting it became. Landmarks they had passed before seemed to shift and change when they looked back, and paths that should have been clear turned into twisted mazes of roots and brambles. The forest was warping around them, and an unspoken fear settled in the pit of each man's stomach, that they might never find their way out. Suddenly, Jim, who had been walking at the rear of the group, stopped dead in his tracks. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The group paused, sniffing the air. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the acrid, metallic tang of smoke. Not the comforting scent of a campfire, but the thick, choking stench of burning rubber and gasoline. David's eyes widened. "Is it ... the trucks again?" Before anyone could answer, a low rumble echoed through the trees, the unmistakable sound of engines turning over, gears grinding, and chains clanking. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was close, far too close. Ed's heart raced as the sound grew louder, reverberating through the dense woods. The mist swirled around them, thickening into an impenetrable wall until they could barely see each other. The forest, once so familiar, had transformed into an alien landscape of shadow and sound. Frank's voice trembled. "We need to get out of here, now." But the rumble of the convoy was all around them, closing in. Through the mist, the faint glow of headlights flickered, cutting through the fog like eerie specters. The trucks, if that's what they were, seemed to be circling them, their invisible wheels crunching on the forest floor, moving in a slow, predatory loop. "What the hell are we supposed to do?" Jim asked, his voice shaking. Ed didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to find a way out, trying to understand what they were facing. This wasn't just some ghost story. This was real. To real. The group huddled together, their eyes scanning the mist for any sign of the phantom convoy. The smell of burning oil was overwhelming now, stinging their eyes and filling their lungs with its foul, suffocating presence. The sound of the engines roared in their ears, deafening and relentless. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The headlights vanished. The forest fell into a heavy, oppressive silence once again. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The fear in the air was palpable, clinging to them like a second skin. It was as if the convoy had been toying with them, playing a game of cat and mouse, and they had narrowly escaped becoming its prey. Henry broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't think we're meant to leave this place." Ed shook his head, refusing to give in to the terror gnawing at his insides. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice firm. "We just need to keep moving. We can't let it, whatever it is, trap us." The group pressed on, their pace quickening as they wove through the trees, desperate to escape the ghostly presence that stalked them. But the deeper they went, the stranger things became. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, flickering like figures moving just out of sight. Whispers floated on the air, unintelligible but chilling, as though the forest itself was alive with unseen voices. And then they saw it. Through the mist, standing in the clearing ahead, was the remnants of a convoy. Rusted trucks, their metal frames twisted and broken, lay scattered like corpses among the trees. The air was thick with the stench of decay and burned rubber. Bullet holes peppered the sides of the vehicles, and long dead vines coiled around the wheels like snakes. But it wasn't the trucks that sent a wave of terror through them. It was the figures standing beside them, shadowy, indistinct figures, dressed in tattered uniforms that looked like they had been worn down by time itself. Their faces were hidden in the fog, but their presence was unmistakable. Soldiers, or what was left of them. Henry stumbled back, his voice barely a whisper. "Are they?" Ed nodded, his throat dry. The convoy, they had found it. But something told them they had ventured too far, that the ghostly soldiers, lost in time, weren't about to let them leave without consequence. The convoy stood before them, a chilling testament to the horrors of war. The air was thick with the smell of oil and decay, as if time itself had frozen around these long-abandoned trucks. Their once gleaming surfaces were now rusted and covered in a layer of grime, their tires deflated and their windows shattered. The jungle had reclaimed much of the area, with vines snaking through the broken windows and foliage growing up through the wrecks. But it wasn't just the vehicles that sent a shiver down Ed's spine. It was the figures' shadowy forms that stood motionless beside the trucks, their outlines barely visible through the mist. They didn't move, but their presence was unmistakable. Soldiers, long dead, but somehow still there, lingering like echoes of a forgotten battle. No one dared to speak. The group stood frozen, their breath shallow, as if the slightest sound would draw the attention of the spectral figures. The silence was oppressive, the kind that presses in on your ears and makes your heartbeat sound impossibly loud. Henry was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't be here." His words hung in the air like a warning. Ed could feel the tension radiating through the group. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave this place before whatever was haunting it took notice of them. But they had come too far to turn back now. They had a mission to uncover the truth about the ghost convoy. Ed swallowed hard, his throat dry. "We need to see this through," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence he was trying to project. "Let's get closer. Maybe there's something here that explains what happened." Frank shook his head, his face pale. "You're out of your mind, Ed. Those things, they're not natural. We should leave before." Before he could finish, the mist around them seemed to shift, thickening and swirling like a living thing. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from behind one of the trucks. It was a slow, deliberate sound, as if someone or something was approaching. David's eyes widened in terror. "Did you hear that?" Ed nodded, his pulse quickening. His hand instinctively went to the flashlight hanging from his belt, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever was out there. Slowly, cautiously, he flicked it on, the beam cutting through the mist. It revealed little, only the twisted wreckage of the trucks and the fog swirling lazily through the trees. But then they saw a figure, emerging from the mist. It was one of the soldiers, dressed in tattered, mud-streaked fatigues, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He moved slowly, as if dragging himself forward, one step at a time. His chest was riddled with bullet holes, and dried blood stained his uniform. But what was most unsettling was the expression on his face, a mix of anguish and anger, as though he had been frozen in the moment of his death. "Jesus Christ," Jim whispered, his voice shaking. Is that one of them?" The soldier stopped a few feet away from the group, his lifeless eyes fixed on them. For a moment, no one moved, no one even breathed. And then, slowly, more figures began to emerge from the fog, dozens of them, all in various states of decay, their uniforms tattered and stained with blood. They surrounded the convoy, standing in eerie silence, their eyes locked onto the group. Ed's heart pounded in his chest. "We need to leave, now." But before anyone could move, the sound of an engine roared to life. One of the trucks, long since dead and rusted, sputtered and groaned as its headlights flickered on. The engine rumbled loudly, drowning out the eerie silence, as if the convoy was being revived by some unseen force. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air grew thick with the stench of burning rubber and gasoline. It was as if they had stepped back in time, to the moment when the convoy had been ambushed. The ghostly soldiers began to move, shuffling toward the trucks with mechanical precision, their lifeless eyes never leaving the group. "What the hell is happening?" Henry shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "We have to go." Ed yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "Now!" The group turned and ran, their feet pounding against the uneven ground as they fled through the trees. The mist seemed to part for them, but the sound of the convoy's engines followed, growing louder and more insistent with every step. Behind them, the ghostly figures moved in unison, their pale faces barely visible through the fog. Ed's breath came in ragged gasps as they stumbled through the underbrush, branches slapping against their arms and faces. The forest was alive with the sounds of the convoy engines roaring, metal grinding, chains clanking. It was as if the dead were chasing them, determined to drag them back to the convoy. David tripped over a root and fell hard, his flashlight tumbling out of his hand. Ed skidded to a stop and rushed back to help him up, glancing over his shoulder at the approaching figures. "They're getting closer," David gasped, his voice thick with fear. Ed hauled him to his feet, his own heart racing in his chest. We need to keep moving." They ran, pushing themselves to the limit as the ghostly convoy closed in. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees blurring together in their frantic dash for safety. The mist swirled around them, disorienting and confusing, but they didn't dare stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they burst through the tree line and into a clearing. The convoy's sounds faded, the roaring engines and clanking chains growing distant until they were nothing more than a faint echo in the mist. The group collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. For a long moment, no one spoke. They were too stunned, too overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. Henry was the first to break the silence, his voice weak. What the hell was that? No one had an answer. They had come to investigate a legend, but what they had found was something far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. Ed stared back at the tree line, the mist still swirling lazily among the trees. He could feel the presence of the convoy, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for them to return. "We need to get out of this place," he said quietly, "before it's too late." The clearing offered little solace. The group sat in a tight circle, their backs to one another, eyes darting between the dark tree line and the swirling mist. The jungle around them was unnervingly quiet, as though the very air was waiting for something. Ed could feel the cold sweat clinging to his skin, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The shadows seemed to move, and with each flicker, his mind conjured images of the ghostly soldiers they had seen just moments ago. Frank wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his face pale and drawn. That wasn't natural, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "We're not dealing with any normal haunting here." Henry, still breathing heavily, nodded in agreement. Those soldiers, they were stuck in that moment, like they never left. Ed glanced at him, the weight of their situation settling heavily on his chest. "Maybe they didn't," he said quietly. "Maybe that convoy was ambushed, and those men, they never made it home." David shivered, wrapping his arms around himself. "We're next if we don't get out of here." But, as the group began to discuss their next move, the air grew thick again, thicker than before, oppressive. The distant rumble of engines, faint at first, began to echo through the jungle once more. The sound crawled toward them like a looming storm, rattling the branches of the trees and causing the mist to swirl unnaturally. "They're coming back," Jim muttered, his voice tinged with panic. He stood, his flashlight shaking in his hand as he scanned the tree line. "We need to move." But just as he turned to bolt, a strange, hollow whisper filled the air. It wasn't any language they recognized, but the intent was clear, pleading, desperate. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the trees and through the mist. "They're trying to talk to us," Henry said, his eyes wide with realization. "They want something." "No," Ed replied, his voice firm. "They're not asking, they're warning us." Suddenly, the mist thickened to the point of near blindness. Ed's heart raced as the sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder. The ground seemed to vibrate under their feet, and a cold, unnatural wind whipped through the clearing. The once distant rumble of the convoy's engines roared back to life, as if the trucks were circling them, unseen but unmistakable. And then the figures returned. They emerged from the mist, soldiers in tattered, blood-stained uniforms, their eyes hollow and filled with an unbearable sadness. But something was different this time. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles, and their hands reached out, grasping at the air as they staggered toward the group. Henry stumbled back, tripping over a rock as one of the figures loomed over him. The ghost's mouth opened, but no sound came out, only the same tortured expression frozen on its face. Its cold, dead eyes locked onto Henry's, and in that moment, he could feel its pain, the anguish of being stuck in this nightmare for eternity. "We have to leave," Ed shouted, grabbing Henry by the arm and pulling him to his feet. "Now!" The group scrambled to their feet, fear gripping them as they pushed through the dense fog, trying to escape the spectral soldiers closing in on them from all sides. but the jungle seemed to warp around them, the trees twisting and contorting as if to trap them within its haunted depths. Every path they took led them back to the clearing, back to the trucks, back to the ghosts. Jim let out a frustrated cry. "We're going in circles. There's no way out." The oppressive weight of the situation was crushing. Every turn, every desperate dash to escape, brought them back to the convoy's eerie presence. It was as though the land itself was keeping them prisoner, just as it had done to those fallen soldiers decades before. David was breathing heavily, his face pale. "What if we're already dead?" "Shut up," Ed snapped. "Don't start thinking like that." But deep down, Ed couldn't shake the gnawing fear that David might be right. The fog, the whispers, the way the convoy appeared and disappeared like a mirage, it all felt wrong. Like they had crossed some invisible boundary between the living and the dead, and now they were caught in a place that wasn't meant for them. As they huddled together, their breath visible in the now frigid air, Ed noticed something glinting in the distance. A faint light, barely perceptible through the thick mist. It flickered, like a dying lantern in the middle of the jungle. "What's that?" Frank asked, pointing toward the light. "I don't know," Ed said, squinting to get a better look, "but it's our only chance." Without waiting for a response, Ed began walking toward the light, the others reluctantly following. Their footsteps were slow and cautious, the eerie stillness of the jungle pressing in on them. The light flickered again, drawing them closer, like a moth to a flame. As they neared, the shape of an old, crumbling structure began to take form. A small, decrepit outpost, half swallowed by the jungle, stood in the clearing. The light was coming from inside, casting long shadows across the walls. "This place," Henry began, his voice barely a whisper. "It feels wrong, but they had no choice. They couldn't keep wandering in circles in the fog. They had to find shelter, answers something." With a deep breath, Ed pushed open the creaky, rusted door, and they stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in old, faded maps and crumbling photographs of soldiers. An old radio sat on a rusted table in the corner, its dial flickering faintly as static crackled through the speakers. But there was something else, a presence. It felt like the room was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. And then, in the corner, they saw a figure, slumped in a chair, its back to them. Jim swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper, is that the figure didn't move. It sat motionless, its head tilted to one side as if listening to something only it could hear. Henry stepped forward, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the figure's shoulder. "Sir," but the moment his hand made contact, the figure's head snapped around, revealing a face that was both familiar and horrifying. It was one of the soldiers from the convoy, but this time, it wasn't just an apparition. It was real, tangible, and its mouth opened, a low, guttural moan escaping from deep within its chest. Ed's blood ran cold. "Run." The group barely had time to process what they had just seen before bolting from the outpost. The dead soldier's moan echoed in their ears as they ran through the crumbling doorway and into the mist-shrouded jungle. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive presence that clung to their skin like the damp fog surrounding them. Each breath they took felt like a struggle, as if the very jungle itself was trying to smother them. Ed's heart pounded as he pushed through the undergrowth, his eyes darting around for any sign of a way out. But the trees seemed to grow closer, more twisted and gnarled with each step. The jungle, which had once been a dense but natural environment, now felt like a cage, a trap designed to keep them in. The whispers, barely audible at first, grew louder, more insistent. They weren't the voices of the living, but the dead, the soldiers who had fallen in this forsaken place. Frank stumbled behind, his legs trembling from fear and exhaustion. "We're never going to get out of here," he gasped, his voice filled with panic. "They won't let us leave." Ed turned back, grabbing Frank by the arm to pull him along. "Don't say that, we're not giving up." But deep down, Even Ed could feel it, the weight of the past pressing down on them, as if the souls of the fallen were pulling them deeper into the jungle, refusing to let go. The very ground beneath their feet felt different now, almost alive with a dark energy that seemed to pulse with the history of the bloodshed that had occurred here. Suddenly, a familiar sound cut through the air, the rumbling of engines. The convoy, again. It was closer now, more real than ever before. The unmistakable clatter of trucks and the low drone of engines filled the clearing, vibrating the earth beneath their feet. But when they looked around, there was nothing, only the swirling mist and the twisted shadows of the jungle. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder, more urgent, as if the convoy was barreling toward them from every direction at once. "They're coming for us," Jim cried out, his eyes wild with fear. Ed spun around, searching for any possible escape, but there was nowhere to go. They were surrounded, trapped in this hellish nightmare with no way out. The sound of boots crunching through the underbrush grew louder, the ghostly soldiers closing in. And then they saw them, emerging from the mist. The spectral soldiers appeared once again. Their faces were still contorted with the same expression of pain and despair, their bodies flickering as if trapped between worlds. They marched toward the group in perfect unison, their eyes locked on Ed and his friends. But this time, there was something different. Their eyes seemed to glow faintly, as if they carried the weight of a message, an unspoken plea that went beyond the boundaries of life and death. "What do they want?" David whispered, his voice trembling. As the soldiers closed in, Ed felt a strange pull, a compulsion to approach them, to face them. He took a step forward, his body moving almost of its own accord. Frank tried to grab him, to hold him back, but Ed shook him off. "We're not getting out of here until we understand what they're trying to tell us," Ed said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. He stepped toward the nearest soldier, his eyes locking onto the figure's hollow, glowing gaze. The soldier didn't move, didn't react, but Ed could feel the presence of something more, a connection to a moment frozen in time. The soldier's uniform was torn and blooded, the remnants of a life cut short, but in his eyes, Ed saw something else, a memory, a fragment of the past that refused to die. Suddenly, images flashed in Ed's mind, scenes of the convoy moving through the jungle, the sound of gunfire, explosions, and screams. The soldiers had been ambushed, their convoy wiped out in a brutal assault. But there was something else, something deeper, darker. Ed could feel the overwhelming sense of betrayal, the anger and despair that had followed the attack. These men had been left behind, forgotten by the living, trapped in a cycle of endless torment. "They're stuck here," Ed whispered, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "They never made it home. They're still fighting the same battle over and over." The ghostly soldier in front of him reached out, his hand hovering inches from Ed's chest. For a moment, the jungle seemed to fade away, and Ed was standing in the middle of the convoy, surrounded by the chaos of war. He could hear the shouts of the soldiers, the deafening roar of explosions, and the cries of the dying. The pain, the fear, the loss, it was all too real. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the vision ended. Ed staggered back, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have to help them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank looked at him like he was insane. "Help them? How? They're dead, Ed. What can we do?" But Ed knew. Deep down, he knew what had to be done. "They need closure," Ed said, his voice firmer now. "They need to know they haven't been forgotten." He turned to the others, his eyes filled with determination. "We have to find their remains. We have to make sure they get home." The others looked at him in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. It sounded impossible, but in this place, this haunted, forsaken jungle, impossible didn't seem to matter anymore. With a renewed sense of purpose, the group gathered their courage and began searching the jungle for any sign of the fallen soldiers. The fog was still thick, the jungle still oppressive, but the ghostly convoy no longer felt like a threat. Instead, it felt like a guide, leading them to the place where the soldiers had fallen. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to tell in the timeless void of the jungle. But eventually, they found it, the wreckage of the convoy, hidden deep within the jungle's grasp. The trucks were rusted and decayed, overgrown with vines and moss, but the skeletons of the soldiers still remained, their bones scattered across the ground. As they stood over the remains, the ghostly figures appeared once again. But this time, there was no menace in their eyes, no anger or despair. Instead, there was peace. Ed knelt beside one of the skeletons, his hand resting gently on the cracked bones. "We'll make sure you get home," he whispered. And with that promise, the jungle seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. The mist began to dissipate, and the ghostly soldiers slowly faded away, their souls finally at rest. The group stood in silence, the weight of what they had just experienced settling over them. They had come face to face with the past, with the pain and suffering of those who had been forgotten. But now, they had a chance to make things right. As they prepared to leave the jungle, Ed couldn't help but glance back one last time. The jungle, once so terrifying, now seemed almost serene. The ghosts were gone, but their memory would live on, and Ed knew that, somehow, they had been part of something much bigger than themselves, a story that had spanned generations, one that would continue long after they were gone. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.